I'm running an organisation with 2,000 humanitarian staff on the ground in Syria, and obviously the absolute priority for us and for them is to increase the protection of civilians who are currently under a double assault from Assad on the one hand and ISIS on the other. Since I'm running an international humanitarian organisation, I'm not going to start pontificating about military action. What I will say is that we've been warning for some time that there's an unsustainable situation in the middle of Syria, and it was going to explode in a way that caused convulsions across Europe. The tragedy is that that's happened not just in Paris, but there was bombings in Beirut when I was there on Thursday as well, and it's certainly high time that there was a far greater unity and coherence of the international response to the tragedies inside Syria.
But do you think the international response then is actually making the humanitarian situation worse, the bombing by the Americans, the Russians, the French and others?
The situation on the ground is that the twin challenge, or the twin attacks from, on the one hand, Assad's barrel bombs, on the other hand, the terror of ISIS, that's what is terrorizing the citizens on the ground, the 17 million Syrians who are still left in the country, and that's what's driving increasing numbers of them, not just into the neighboring states of Jordan and Lebanon, but also across the Aegean Sea into Europe via Greece and then up into Germany and northern Europe. And that is the fundamental challenge there. Obviously, the Russian entry into the fray over the last 6 weeks has further complicated the situation, but one shouldn't be under any illusions about where the fundamental blame for the civilian tragedy lies. It lies with the government of Syria and with groups like ISIS that are terrorizing the local population.
And does the forceful intervention, therefore, by countries like the United States actually then contribute to the ultimate solution, in your view?
I hope you understand I've got to be extremely careful since I've got 2,000 of my own staff on the ground there. The truthful answer to your question is that it all depends. Military action has in the past and can in some circumstances relieve civilian suffering. At the same time, there is experience of where it's made it worse, and it all depends on how it's done, what proper deconfliction there is between the humanitarian efforts that are taking place on the ground and the military efforts, and of course, above all, whether or not the military effort is there to pound civilian infrastructure or whether it is genuinely seeking to avoid civilian casualties. So for me, as someone who's leading a humanitarian organisation, my priority has to be first to call attention to the unspeakable horror that's going on inside Syria at the moment. Secondly, to call for a massive upgrade in the protection of civilians, both through humanitarian and through the way in which the military campaign is being conducted. And thirdly, of course, to say that the situation in the neighbouring countries is increasingly dire, and that's what's driving increasing numbers of people into Europe.
And what do you say to the majority now of state governors in the United States who are saying, well, look, one of the people who said he was a refugee, at least, actually went on and did these deadly attacks in Paris. We don't want any more Syrian refugees coming to our states in America.
I say that refugee resettlement has been an enormous success story in the United States and elsewhere, actually. But as for the United States, everyone from Einstein to Madeleine Albright to Larry Brinn, these are all refugees who've come to this country and become patriotic and productive citizens. Security screening to get into the US is extremely rigorous. It's harder to get into the US as a refugee than through any other route. And I think it's very important, we're making this point here in the US, that the US continues to stand up for the right of refugees to be treated with dignity, for the most vulnerable to be resettled in countries like the US, and for that to be done in an organised and coordinated way. It would be a terrible tragedy if the equation of terrorism with refugees was one of the products of this conflict. And the choice for America is about how it performs a global leadership role on refugee resettlement as well as on politics. The challenge in Europe is to make sure that refugee resettlement is properly organised, properly screened and properly documented, because that's the fundamental need that exists for the many who are crossing the borders at the moment.
But as it now stands, with this level of objection, President Obama is not going to be able to deliver on his pledge of taking the numbers, relatively small numbers, that he said the United States would be prepared to absorb.
You're right to say that President Obama's commitment of 10,000 Syrian refugees a year is relatively limited, certainly for a country of 330 million people. However, it's premature to say that in the 20-odd remaining states, after all there are 50 states in the Union, that they're not going to be able to take Syrians. One interesting point is that there are very successful Syrian-American communities right across this country, both west, central and east. And they are saying that they want their fellow countrymen from Syria to come and become productive citizens in the US. As I say, the security screening is serious, and what there's a need for, obviously, is for that to be followed through.